be both very much like what has come before, and yet renewed in ways which cannot be entirely anticipated, and certainly not planned. But that which may take root and spring up in the midst of that most distant desert may help to revitalize our weary world as well. Thank you for your attention, and I will take some questions. Is there a question from anybody I haven't completely irritated yet?
I got a theological question.
Okay.
Here's one that I've puzzled with for many, many years, decades actually. We established a colony on the same Mars. How's that going to play in with the Armageddon?
Depends on whose theory you're dealing with. If we deal with the biblical text, I would point folks to, for example, 2 Peter 3, which makes the point that the so-called Armageddon actually involves the dissolving of all material elements, and start them from there. Yeah, exactly. And that it often has very little to do with the imaginings and various other problems of 20th and 21st century televangelists who are not particularly well schooled in the Bible.
Right, I'm talking about biblical.
Yeah, I mean, it's intriguing because in that biblical text in 2 Peter 3, you already find the biblical text in contradiction to the science of its day for maintaining that those distant points also consist of elements. We take an assertion like that for granted. I look at a text like that and say, that's kind of interesting, seeing as all of the Greek science at that time said, burn up the elements. You know, the elements are here, and they are, on a certain level, indestructible, because that's why they're here, because, as Aristotle would teach you, matter's eternal.
But Psalms 119 refers to the heavens being stretched out like a tent.
Yeah.
To me, talks about universe expansion.
Yeah. I've had some of those kind of thoughts myself. But anywho, not to attempt to extract a scientific text from them, but there's an interesting. There are interesting elements of the text which are often neglected by some moderns. Thank you for your question.
Discussions forever.
Yeah. Let's not go into all the minutiae there. Yes, sir.
You said that 1277 they refuted Aristotle. Was that the Pope or who?
It was actually the Bishop of Paris. He was dealing with certain teachings that were going on there at the university, or things that they were worried might end up being taught, and came up with a laundry list of difficulties in Aristotle, some of which would be of a very arcane and, to our purposes today, kind of irrelevant substance, but some had some really interesting outcomes as a result of those condemnations. And it's always fun to point out to folks that modern science rests upon the church condemning Aristotle, because historically speaking it does. And the ones that get the most attention now have to deal with those who are pertaining to Aristotle's statements with regard to the limits of divine capability. And the point that the Bishop of Paris, among others, were making was that, look, you can't tell God that he can't do anything other than, all right, he won't establish a logical contradiction. That was the point that Tempier was getting at in these condemnations, and saying, therefore, of course God can make more than one world. The point that Tempier was getting at in the short term was, that doesn't assert that he did, just that he could. But it led to then the philosophers and theologians then speculating at great length about, and if he did, what would those worlds be like? And it's really kind of interesting when, obviously, astronomy is at a very low ebb at this point. The connection between observation and actual theorizing is pretty minimal, and yet they were already creating concepts that we now have to have, like vacuum, like universality of law. That it's kind of hard to imagine doing science without them, and yet they were trying to do science without them under the Greek philosophy.
That brings up an interesting point, that Newton believed that the laws were inherent in the creation, that the Creator established those laws so man could understand creation.
Yeah.
As much as he could.
Yeah, and that what people tend to also forget is that Newton also wrote more theology than he wrote science. Could have been pretty strange stuff, but he gave over a lot more thought to that. And Kepler, aforementioned, was first and foremost in his studies a student of divinity, in terms of his actual academic training, and then turned to mathematics from there as well. but was a rather interesting person from the standpoint of a fairly firm confession in his context too. Anyway, fun people. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm not quite sure I understand what your final point was.
Okay.
Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure.
We're not going to Mars for technical reasons. We're not going to Mars for scientific reasons. We're not going to Mars for economic reasons. But you kind of left us hanging out there as to what reasons we should be going.
Yeah. Well, the arching theme is if you have a civilization that's functioning properly, in other words, is trying to pass on to the future the benefits which we have inherited and build on them, not just materially, but in terms of the legacy of all elements of culture, which some elements are religious, but many more of them are not immediately perceived to be such. But rather the idea of a continuity, making the world a better place than you found it, that's really not present in our culture at this point. And so our difficulty is not a handful of us or thousands of people sitting around saying, you know, scientifically this isn't that hard. You know, a theme we've hit over the years here has been we're far better prepared to go to Mars now than we were to go to the moon in '69. So why aren't we? Because there's nothing compelling it. And there's nothing compelling it because, building on some points that Tony was making the other day, because people would rather engage in narcissistic activities than build anything. Why on earth would I put my life at risk if I can, you know, play video games and, you know, it's all about me. It's all about me. You know, you don't worry about your kids. You don't worry about your parents. We warehouse old people in facilities and can't be troubled to have a next generation of children because, after all, if that gets in the way of the second home or the lake place or the boat, etc., oh, there's just too much of a hassle. Well, I mean, good grief, on a certain level, we're kind of at end of line then. That's a bit of a problem. I reflect all the way back in this regard to the, I think it was the second convention back in '99. Where there was a libertarian who was there on behalf of a institute in D.C., and she was explaining that if she had been around at the time of the settlement of the New World, she never would have left I would have stayed in the Netherlands. That's where civilization was. That's where all of the things. Like, why are you here? if what you want is material satisfaction, you've got that. I'm literally preaching to the choir here. The reason you're here is precisely because you've got larger civilizational concerns, right? And even if we disagree about a whole host of philosophical and theological points, you're all going to agree that you want to leave a better place in the future than the one that you got. And what you're, in many cases, troubled by is the fact that most of the people that you know, that you work with, that are your neighbors, don't have the slightest idea why you care about this. Because this is simply one example of a much larger problem. It's out here in the outliers where you really see how far it's drifted, because it's the same phenomenon that's making a mess of a whole lot of other things. But we're very conscious of it gathered as a group of very disparate backgrounds, because this is it's a frustration that binds us together. And in that regard, the civilizational concerns have to be one of our first order priorities, because the technological points, just to repeat myself again, we have a pretty good grasp on what they are and being relatively easy to solve. But if nobody wants to go anywhere because they'd rather sit in their parents' basement and play Nintendo, we're not going anywhere. Try getting them to care enough to read, to learn anything. I'm going to go off on a whole separate riff on that, so I'll stop there. Next question before I rant. Yes.
Actually, I've got a little bit of a statement.
Okay.
I believe that God is hardwired into at least some of us the urge to explore. That's why I work in the industry I do in the space program.
Mm-hmm.
I also believe, a little bit tossing in with the history, that if you look at the great civilizations in the past, Rome, Greece, Persia, Spain, France, England, when they decided that they no longer wanted to expand their horizons and explore, immediately decay set in. What I see happening here with the United States is, and it's kind of scary, I see that self-satisfied, egocentric, self-absorption that has started appearing in Spain after they reached the peak of their power.
Yeah.
Rome
Yeah.
had its own problems, with just eternal decay, but
And even though a person may not agree with you or with me regarding any theological element of this, they're going to be agreed with us that this is a civilizational issue. It's not just a technological one. And that's the point that we really have to hammer home. We have to elevate their vision again. Yeah.
I think what we're dealing with to a certain degree is what, if the human being is the one with the soul, but all life, at least at the animal level, is that with the spirit. I think that this is not purely a matter of the soul, it is also a matter of the spirit.
Mm-hmm.
In that if you have life in you, you should be exploring. And I learned this every time I leave the door open to my basement and my cat finds his way down.
Exactly. Yes.
It doesn't
Yeah.
require a soul to go exploring.
And other things find their way in, too. Thus we spray for them regularly and set traps.
sometimes with the help of the cat.
Yeah, yeah. Coming from Texas, where a lot of our spiders will be larger than mice, it seems like, you're very conscious of, keep them out, stop being quite so inquisitive, go and be inquisitive somewhere else. But yeah, you're right, it's the nature of life is to want to explore in that
It's
fashion.
almost a double tragedy when somebody can't get off the couch.
Well, exactly, because it shows that it's precisely well, this is a loaded term, it's an unnatural act. It's an act of a perversion of will. In other words, you're actually choosing to do that which you know to not be natural, to say, my great goal in life is to accomplish nothing. Really? I mean, crustaceans are doing better than you. I'm sorry?
The sad thing is, there are people out there like that.
Oh, yeah, and their name is Legion. They're everywhere. Yes, sir.
I don't know if anybody's addressed this before I came in, but I'm wondering, we're spending a lot of effort now to find other planets that nearly like the Earth, the size of the Earth and all that stuff. How do you treat that in your mind if we did find another planet with life on it?
I'm right back there. Were you here for the early part of the talk?
No.
Okay. I'd say I'm very comfortable going right back to what Nicholas of Cusa was saying back in the 1430s, 1440s of, in the late Middle Ages, the church took for granted if there's another world, there's life there. And he said, and we would expect it, if we could go to the stars, that we'd find a life comparable to those places there as well. And he's not some theologian off in a corner. He was one of the most important cardinals of the early 15th century.
What really bothers me about that, though, I thought the Christians kind of thought this is the only place that there could be life.
Well, and that's part of what I've been trying to debunk here, some rather strange ideas. I've hit on this theme a couple times in the past because you get these kind of weird ideas both inside the church and outside the church of, well, what does the church teach? And the whole point is that, it's been maintaining since the 13th century that it was entirely possible that there were more than one world. And if you have a very consistent track record of significant theologians from the early 1400s on saying not only could there be life, but there's a very high probability of it. So by the time you get to Kepler, he's getting into very specific detail of how the life would be adapted to the local circumstances in which it has been placed. The idea of the adaptability of species according to common natural laws which could be found everywhere, which is something I covered early in the paper, but I'll repeat again here. The idea of matter existing anywhere other than here was a breaking out of Greek pagan thought as found in Aristotle, because Aristotle maintained it was logically impossible for there to be more than one world. And that the church in 1277 said, no, there can be more than one world. There can be a vacuum between those worlds, and the laws of nature will be uniform no matter where you go. And those were all tremendous novelties in thought.